It started with the sound of laughter that didn't belong in my yard. That kind of laughter that makes your stomach twist before your brain catches up. I was standing on my porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, when I saw her for the first time. Helen Dorsey, the new HOA president of Ridgeway Estates. Designer sunglasses, tight curls lacquered into position, and a clipboard that looked heavier than her conscience. She was pointing at my mailbox like it had personally offended her, while two other board members nodded behind her as if she were preaching gospel. That was the moment I knew peace was a temporary thing. For 10 years, Ridgeway Estates had been my refuge. A quiet neighborhood tucked between whispering pines and a slow-moving creek, where you could hear children's laughter in summer and the sound of lawnmowers humming like bees. I bought my house here after my wife Lillian passed away. She loved the garden, the jasmine, and the morning mist that hung low over the fence. I promised myself I'd keep it the way she left it, a sanctuary of green life and gentle memories. But Helen, she saw it as a violation of community standards. It began small. A note slipped under my door. "We've noticed weeds growing along the side path." Then another, "Your garden fountain exceeds acceptable height limits." I ignored them at first. Everyone knew Helen had a thing for control. She once fined a family because their Christmas lights were too bright. But when I got a third letter, this time from my non-compliant mailbox, I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about power. I tried reasoning with her. I even went to the HOA meeting, something I swore I'd never do. The community hall was packed with neighbors, all staring at Helen like students afraid to interrupt their teacher. When it was my turn to speak, I told her I'd replace the mailbox and trim the jasmine if that would make peace. She smiled, that tight, polite smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "We just want everyone to follow the same rules." "Mr. Carson?" Her tone wrapped the words in honey. But I could taste the poison beneath. After that meeting, things escalated faster than I could have imagined. One morning, I woke to find bright orange paint splattered across my front fence. The words "rule breaker" were scrawled in thick, dripping letters. My heart pounded as I looked around the yard. No sign of anyone. I called the police, but they shrugged. "Probably kids," the officer said. "We'll make a note." But I knew better. Helen's house was directly across the street, and from her window I could see her silhouette sipping coffee. Her lips curled into something almost like satisfaction. That same week, I received a citation for unapproved exterior damage. My fence had been vandalized, and she fined me for it. I tried to appeal, denied. I hired a lawyer. The OA bylaws were airtight, and Helen knew how to wield them like a weapon. My savings started to drain. My nights turned restless. I'd wake at 2 a.m. and see motion lights flicker near the garden, but when I looked outside, there was nothing, just the ghostly shape of the jasmine swaying in the dark. Then the garden started dying. It began with the roses. Lillian's roses. Their petals browned overnight, curling like burnt paper. Then the jasmine, the lilia, the ivy, all wilting, one after another. I sent samples to a friend at the local nursery. He called me the next day, voice low. "Mark, this isn't natural. There's herbicide in the soil, a strong one." I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. Someone had poisoned the garden. Someone wanted to erase Lillian from this house. I set up cameras that night, hidden among the hedges. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Then on the 4th at 2:47 a.m., motion sensors triggered. I watched the footage with trembling hands, a shadow moving near the garden bed, crouching, pouring something from a small canister. When the figure turned, the porch light caught her face for a second. Helen Dorsey. I couldn't breathe. The police came again, and this time I had proof. But Helen was smarter than I thought. Her lawyer claimed the footage was grainy and that it could have been doctored. The HOA board sided with her, saying she was checking on community safety concerns. I was furious, helpless, and humiliated. Every morning I saw her smile from across the street, a little wider than the day before. My neighbors started avoiding me. Whispers spread. "He's paranoid. He's making it up. Poor man's losing his mind since his wife died." That's when I realized what Helen was really doing. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was isolating me, destroying my credibility, piece by piece, until I looked like a bitter old man fighting ghosts. It worked. I stopped going to OA meetings. I stopped answering calls. My house felt colder, emptier. Even the walls seemed to sigh. Then one night, I came home from my late shift at the courthouse. Yes, I'm a judge, though I keep my personal life quiet. The air smelled wrong, sharp, and chemical. As I rounded the corner, my heart dropped. Smoke, thick and black, curling from the roof. I ran toward the door, but flames were already licking the curtains inside. The house, my house, was on fire. Neighbors gathered, phones out, recording. The fire trucks came, sirens howling, but it was too late. The roof caved in like paper. I stood there, the heat against my face, watching Lillian's world turn to ash. The police questioned me for hours, asking about insurance, about enemies, and about accidental causes. But I saw Helen watching from her driveway, robe neatly tied, face illuminated by the blaze. And in her eyes, that same satisfaction. The investigation dragged on for weeks. They called it suspicious, but without direct evidence, it went nowhere. I moved into a small rental on the edge of town. Every night I stared at the charred remains of my old home from afar, the smell of burnt jasmine still haunting my clothes. I'd lost everything, the garden, the memories, the peace. But what Helen didn't know was that I hadn't lost my resolve. Months passed. I returned to work quietly, handling cases like nothing had changed. But inside, something had hardened. Then one afternoon, as I reviewed a new set of files, a familiar name appeared on my desk. State versus Dorsey, Helen. My pulse quickened. I flipped through the file, charges of fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying community funds. The HOA's finances had been audited, and the one who'd burned my world to the ground was about to stand trial. In my courtroom, I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had spent 18 months trying to destroy my life, and now she was walking straight into my domain. Justice, as it turned out, had a wicked sense of humor. When the day of the hearing came, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Helen walked in, immaculate as ever, pearls, pressed suit, eyes scanning the room with practiced superiority. Then she saw me behind the bench. For the first time, her composure cracked. Just a flicker, a blink too long, a tremor in the jaw. She tried to recover, but the damage was done. She knew. And I knew she knew as I read through the charges, my voice steady, her gaze darted to the floor. The evidence was overwhelming: bank transfers, forged receipts, witness statements. She had siphoned thousands from the HOA account to fund her own renovations. The woman who fined me for my mailbox had stolen from every neighbor she claimed to protect, but I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just listened, letting the weight of her actions fill the room. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. About life finding its own quiet symmetry. As the prosecution laid out their case, I couldn't help but think of Lillian's garden. How beauty can be fragile, but roots run deep. Helen thought she'd burned everything I had, but she only lit the fuse on her own downfall. And as the courtroom clock ticked on, I realized that sometimes justice doesn't need a flame to burn. The courtroom felt heavier that morning, as if the air itself understood the irony of what was about to unfold. Every creak of the wooden benches, every whisper that fluttered through the crowd, carried a strange electricity. I had presided over hundreds of hearings in my years on the bench, but none like this. The defendant sitting before me had once stood on my lawn, smirking at my ruined garden, pretending to be the law in a neighborhood of fences and fear. And now, here she was, clutching a folder like a lifeline. Surrounded by walls, she could no longer control. Helen Dorsey didn't look like a villain anymore. Gone was the iron confidence, the commanding tilt of her chin, the lipstick that used to gleam like fresh paint. She looked smaller under the fluorescent lights, still tidy, still composed, but hollow around the eyes. Guilt has a way of shrinking people. I kept my face neutral, the way judges are trained to. But inside, I could feel the storm rising. Her attorney stood up first, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue. He spoke about administrative misunderstandings, about clerical errors and unintended oversights, the kind of words designed to dilute the truth until it sounds almost harmless. But when the prosecutor began to lay out the evidence, even the jury's expressions hardened. They projected documents on the screen, fake invoices, altered receipts, and inflated budgets for playground repairs that never happened. Line after line, signature after signature. All hers. I watched Helen as the details unfolded. She sat perfectly still, but her fingers trembled on the table. Her gaze flicked once toward me, searching for something, empathy maybe, or weakness. She found neither. I met her eyes briefly, long enough for her to realize that whatever game she thought she was playing was over as witnesses testified. A strange calm settled over me. My mind drifted to the night of the fire, to the glow that had devoured everything I loved. I could still hear the sound, that low crackle like laughter from the dark. For months I'd buried the anger, the helplessness. I had told myself that forgiveness was strength. But sitting there, watching her flounder under the weight of her own deceit, I realized forgiveness isn't something you give to your enemies. It's something you earn by letting the truth finally breathe. The trial stretched for days. Each session peeled away another layer of Helen's polished facade. Neighbors came forward, people who had once feared her. One woman, Mrs. Lang, tearfully confessed that Helen had threatened to fine her for feeding stray cats, unless she signed off on false HOA meeting minutes. A contractor testified that Helen had demanded kickbacks for approving neighborhood maintenance jobs. Piece by piece, her empire of intimidation collapsed. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. During cross-examination, Helen's composure broke. The prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Dorsey, did you believe you were above the rules you enforced?" Helen's lips trembled. She hesitated, then muttered, "Someone had to keep order." The prosecutor leaned in. "Even if that meant destroying people?" Helen's eyes flicked toward me again. For a moment, her mask slipped entirely, and there it was, the same cold pride I'd seen across the street, watching my home burn. "They needed to be reminded who's in charge," she said softly. The room went silent. Her lawyer's face drained of color. The jury didn't move. It was a confession, not just to fraud, but to the sickness that had driven her all along. Control. When the court adjourned that evening, I walked out through the side corridor alone. The sunset outside was bleeding gold across the windows, warm and merciless. I stood there for a long time, staring at the light, thinking about justice, how it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits, quietly, patiently, until the scales tip on their own. 2 weeks later came the sentencing day. The courtroom was packed again, standing room only. The story had made local headlines. HOA president accused of fraud. Neighborhood tyrant faces justice. Reporters filled the aisles, pens scratching like restless insects. I sat behind the bench, my robe heavy on my shoulders. The smell of old wood and ink around me. Helen entered in a pale gray suit, hands clasped in front of her. There were no pearls this time, no polished charm. She looked straight ahead, refusing to meet my eyes. I could almost feel the heat from that old fire ghosting through the room, as if memory itself had come to watch. The bailiff called the court to order. The prosecutor summarized the case: theft of community funds, falsifying records, and abuse of authority. Her lawyer asked for leniency, claiming she had served her community tirelessly and had succumbed to stress. The words hung in the air, thin as paper. Then it was my turn. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I reminded the court that leadership carries weight, that power is a mirror, reflecting who we truly are when no one's watching. I spoke about responsibility, about how greed disguised as order corrodes everything around it. As I talked, Helen's head lowered slightly, her hands twisting in her lap. Finally, I pronounced the sentence: 2 years in state prison, 5 years probation, and restitution of stolen funds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her lawyer froze. Helen didn't move. I expected anger, maybe tears, but she just sat there, lips parted, eyes unfocused. For a moment, I wondered if she finally understood what she'd done, or if she was simply stunned that the world had finally told her no. After the gavel fell, the noise erupted, reporters shouting, spectators whispering. Helen was escorted away, her heels clicking softly on the tile. As she passed the bench, she looked up at me one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes, no defiance. Just confusion, like someone waking from a dream and realizing the fire was real. When the room emptied, I stayed behind. The silence pressed against me like fog. I removed my robe and set it neatly on the chair, then walked outside into the afternoon light. The city was alive, oblivious. Cars passed, people laughed, and birds darted between trees. Life continued, indifferent and beautiful. That evening I drove back to Ridgeway Estates. It had been nearly a year since the fire. The lot where my house once stood was now overgrown with wild grass and daisies, nature reclaiming what arrogance had tried to erase. I parked near the old fence, the one still faintly stained from the orange paint. The smell of ash had faded, replaced by damp earth and faint sweetness from the flowers. I stood there for a long time, the breeze tugging at my sleeves, listening to the whisper of leaves. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Then I noticed movement near the corner. A young couple stood on the sidewalk, looking at a "for sale" sign planted in the soil. The woman smiled, pointing toward where the garden used to be. "It's perfect," she said. The man nodded, his arm around her shoulders. I felt my chest tighten, not with grief this time, but with something like hope. The idea that maybe the land could heal, that maybe new laughter could replace the silence I turned to leave. But something caught my eye, a small patch of jasmine sprouting through the grass. Tiny white petals trembling in the wind. I knelt down, touched the leaves gently. Somehow, against the odds, the roots had survived. Lillian's jasmine, reborn through the ashes. I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. Over the next weeks, I found myself visiting the site often. Sometimes after work, sometimes late at night when the world was quiet. I began to see the neighborhood differently. The same houses, the same fences, but stripped of fear. Without Helen's rain, people seemed lighter. Children played on the street again. Mrs. Lang waved when she saw me. Even the air felt freer, as if the whole place had exhaled. But justice, I learned, isn't a straight line. A month after sentencing, I received a letter at my office. No return address, just my name written in careful, looping handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. I opened it. The handwriting was familiar, neat, precise. I was wrong, it read. Not about the rules, but about the people. I thought control meant safety, but I only built walls around myself. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I never meant for the fire. It wasn't supposed to go that far. No signature, but I didn't need one. I sat back in my chair, the paper trembling in my hands. Part of me wanted to tear it, to throw it away. Another part wanted to believe her. Maybe she hadn't struck the match herself. Maybe she had just created the kind of hatred that would. Either way, the fire had already burned everything that could be punished. I folded the letter, placed it in my drawer, and never spoke of it again. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be understood. Time passed. The seasons turned. The empty lot was bought, the new couple moved in, and soon laughter began to echo again through Ridgeway Estates. Every spring I drive by and see the jasmine blooming stronger, spreading farther. The past doesn't vanish, but it learns how to live quietly among new beginnings. And sometimes, when the night is still, I imagine Helen walking through a prison yard somewhere. Head tilted toward the stars, realizing at last that control is a cage you build with your own hands. I wonder if she remembers the man whose house burned because of her pride. I wonder if she dreams of fire, but I don't hate her anymore. I don't need to. Because the one thing she could never destroy was the part of me that believed in balance. Lillian used to say that even in ashes, something living waits. And she was right. I saw it in the jasmine. I saw it in the laughter of strangers where sorrow once stood. In the end, justice didn't roar. It whispered. And I listened. So if you ever find yourself in a place where someone tries to play God with your peace, remember this story. Remember that control without compassion turns to poison. And that truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds a way to bloom again. Because sometimes the fire that destroys you is the same one that forges your freedom. If you felt that, like, share and subscribe to Stories 87, where every flame finds its justice and every story finds its voice.